Hey there. Tonight, you're in classical Athens, where public nudity is a virtue. Grown men debate ethics in the shadow of a temple full of weaponized gods, and the cure for a headache might involve goat urine and a geometry lesson. Drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing this little time-traveling community gathering here from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's drift far, far away. Congratulations, you've just won the worst prize in human history. A one-way ticket to 450 BCE Athens. No, there's no return policy. And yes, customer service is non-existent, because they haven't invented customers yet. It's quiet at first. Too quiet. This is the last moment of peace you'll get for the next 16 hours of raw, unfiltered survival mode. You haven't even opened your eyes, but something already feels wrong. No gentle hum of an air purifier, no soft glow of your charging phone, just the sharp, gritty feeling of steel wool against your skin. Except it's not steel wool, it's luxury linen, the kind that would make a sandpaper factory weep with pride. Underneath you, straw, not the cute rustic Instagram kind, actual dried grass, tossed onto a dirt floor and called bedding. It's like sleeping on a compost heap, only itchier, and with more opportunities for mysterious rashes. Then the air hits you like a slap from a particularly judgmental ancient god. It smells like wood smoke blended with medieval gym socks, doused in olive oil that's been aging since the Trojan War, and steeped in 2,400 years of bad decisions. There's time in there too, nature's polite apology. You finally crack open your eyes, literally, because they're already protesting. Light filters through what ancient Greeks optimistically called a window. It's just a hole in the wall, covered in thin linen. Offers about as much privacy as a fishnet bodysuit, and maybe even less weather protection. Above you, the ceiling sags with "please don't fall today" energy. Wooden beams, crooked and tired, look like they were assembled by someone who once heard the word carpentry in passing. The walls are stone, patched lazily with clay and reeds in a pattern that radiates defeat. Next to you, a single clay lamp sits in a puddle of soot. No glass shade, no on-off switch, no USB port, just oil, a wick, and a quiet promise to set the house on fire if you sneeze too hard. And across from you, someone else begins to stir. They're buried under a blanket that might be repurposed sailcloth or possibly just burlap with dreams. This is what passes for shared housing. No doors, no rooms, no privacy, just a communal pile of humanity and a vague agreement not to stab each other before breakfast. The floor under your feet is packed dirt. Not charming, not rustic, just dirt. Stepped on so many times it's harder than concrete, but still manages to look and smell exactly like dirt. It's like standing on a yoga mat made of disappointment and geological trauma. Outside, a rooster crows, and suddenly you understand why alarm clocks were invented. This isn't the cheerful cock-a-doodle-doo from storybooks. It's a guttural, vengeful scream from a bird with a grudge. He's not announcing the dawn. He's declaring war on your eardrums. You stumble toward what might generously be called a door. It's a wooden plank leaned against a wall with hope and little else. No hinges, no handle, no lock. Just push and pray it doesn't crash down and wake the rest of the house, where sleeping in is a concept no one will invent for another 1,000 years. The courtyard is small, boxed in, and already alive. The vine clings to the roof like it's trying to flee. Someone has watered the ground to keep the dust down, which is the ancient equivalent of fighting a wildfire with a cup of tea. A woman stands by a basin, sleeves rolled up, washing her hands. She nods at you with the weary acceptance of someone who's lived her entire life without Netflix. She offers you a cloth, not out of kindness, but because your face clearly needs it, and your breath, already violating ancient laws of decency. The water is cold, metallic, and tastes faintly of earth. In other words, it tastes like dirt with a superiority complex. Your fingers move automatically, remembering what it's like to wash something instead of pressing a button. No face wash, no moisturizer, no SPF. Just water, hope, and the creeping knowledge that your skincare routine has officially downgraded to splash and pray. In the corner of the courtyard, something resembling breakfast waits. Barley bread, dense as a brick, flavorless as despair, not sourdough, not warm, just a heavy slab of ancient carbohydrates that could double as self-defense. Next to it, a couple of figs, sad, suspicious, the kind of fruit that makes you understand why ancient people invented gods. Someone had to take responsibility for how disappointing these are. A few herbs sit beside them, adding the illusion of care. Your feast is barely enough to qualify as survival. You eat not because you want to, but because there's nothing else. No coffee, no eggs, no toast, just stone bread and existential fruit. It tastes like responsibility, like the crushing weight of knowing every future meal will require you to lower your expectations until they tunnel through the floor. The absence of coffee alone is enough to make you question the foundation of civilization. How did they function? How did they wake up, form thoughts, make choices without caffeine? They didn't. That's the truth. They just accepted that feeling like garbage until noon was part of the human experience. There were no lattes, no shots of espresso, just vague suffering and watered-down wine. Voices rise in the distance, children laughing, probably at you, goats bleating, almost certainly judging you. Someone yells across a wall, gossiping about the weird new person who can't figure out how to use a clay pot. You catch snippets of Greek, but not the stuff you learned in that college classics course. This is street Greek, fast, lived in, casual, and laced with profanities lost to time. The language barrier isn't just words, it's everything. Tone, rhythm, attitude. These people don't talk, they perform, with their hands, their eyebrows, their entire torsos. Meanwhile, you're standing there, armed with a handful of emojis and a podcast vocabulary. It's like being dropped into an improv show where everyone else rehearsed for years, and you're still trying to find the stage. But here's what slowly dawns on you, like an unwanted sunrise creeping across your face. No one here is asking what you're supposed to do. There's no schedule to check, no email to answer, no feed to scroll through. Just sunlight stretching over stone like it has nowhere else to be. And the creeping realization that you're going to have to learn how to exist without any of the digital scaffolding that's held your life together for years. The silence is brutal. Your thumb twitches, searching for a phone that doesn't exist. Your eyes look for screens that haven't been invented. The absence of podcasts, playlists, pings, it's deafening. It's digital withdrawal. And the rehab plan is history. The rest of it. All of it. From now on. By mid-morning, the house has erupted into what can only be described as controlled chaos. A boy darts across the courtyard, chasing a chicken. Not for fun, because that chicken is dinner. And if it escapes, no one eats. He's laughing and panicking at the same time, like someone who's learnt that survival is a full-contact sport. Ancient Greece isn't charming, it's just Survivor, without the camera crew or the prize money. A woman needs bread at a low table. She doesn't look up. She doesn't need to. One flower-covered hand waves vaguely in the boy's direction. She's developed the ancient Greek version of Mum Radar, capable of detecting trouble through walls, corners, and possibly dimensions. Someone hands you a cup. Clay, chipped at the rim, filled with something they call wine. It's more like grape juice that gave up halfway through fermentation, watered down until you're not sure if you're drinking, or just hydrating artistically. No one explains. They don't need to. You drink because it's wet, slightly alcoholic, and declining would probably violate some sacred law of hospitality. one that ends with you exiled to somewhere even worse than this. A man walks through the gate carrying bundles of herbs, oregano, thyme, and something that smells like it could either cure a headache or summon the dead. He nods at the group with the calm of someone who's accepted his fate as the designated plant guy, in a world where excitement means the bread didn't burn. There's no ceremony to any of it. No one makes announcements. No one explains. People just move, efficiently, repetitively, doing the same things they've done every day for decades. Survival here isn't dramatic, it's maintenance. Those herbs, they're not just seasoning, they're medicine, they're air freshener, they're the thin, fragrant line between you and scurvy. Oregano fights infections, thyme soothes coughs. Every leaf has a job, because waste is a concept these people can't afford to entertain. And speaking of things they can't afford, cleanliness, or, more accurately, the complete and utter absence of it. Your morning routine consists of splashing yourself with water that tastes like ancient regret. No soap, no shampoo, no conditioner, just minerals and hope. The water comes from a well or a cistern that collects rainwater, along with whatever else falls from the sky. It's not filtered, it's not purified, and it definitely hasn't been tested for bacteria. You're basically washing your face with nature's primordial soup, complete with microscopic life forms that are probably developing their own civilization inside your drinking water. Dental hygiene doesn't exist. Your teeth get cleaned when you eat abrasive food, which is basically everything. Ancient Greek cuisine doubles as a natural toothbrush made of sand and disappointment. People chew on twigs to clean their teeth. It's as effective as it sounds, which explains why anyone over 30 looks like they've survived a brutal hockey career. And the twig situation, somehow worse than it sounds. We're not talking minty dental picks. These are random sticks, the kind people hope will scrape off some of the leftover food and plague. Sometimes they work, sometimes they just push the filth around, sometimes they snap off, and you spend the day digging splinters out of your gums with your fingernails. Deodorant hasn't been invented yet, so everyone smells like a combination of wood smoke, olive oil, sweat, and what can only be described as eau de humain. You quickly realize people don't stand downwind out of politeness. It's survival instinct. The collective scent of an ancient Greek city in summer could bring a modern sewage worker to tears. Hair care? Not really a thing. You've got whatever hair texture the gods gave you, plus whatever weeks of washing with water and hope have added to it. Hairstyles are basically whatever keeps it out of your face while you try not to die. Elaborate braids exist, but mostly to keep your hair from catching fire while you cook over open flame. Women use combs made of bone or wood. But the goal is function, not fashion. Men let their hair grow until it becomes a problem. Then they hack it off with whatever sharp thing is nearby. The result? A society full of people who look like they've styled their hair with a rake during an earthquake. And don't even get me started on what happens when nature calls. Let's just say toilet paper is still about 1,900 years away from being invented. Actually, no, we're not leaving it at that, because it's too horrifying not to address. Public latrines are stone benches with holes cut into them. If you're lucky, they sit over running water. If not, they hover above a pit. Multiple people use them at the same time. What should be a private biological function becomes an awkward social event no one asked for. As for wiping, pottery shards, small stones, maybe cloth, if you're feeling luxurious. The Romans will eventually invent a communal sponge on a stick that everyone shares. Thankfully, this is Greece, so we're spared that particular horror. Your cup is empty now. That last sip of grape-flavored water has done absolutely nothing to prepare you for what counts as cuisine in ancient Greece. The taste lingers, earthy, slightly sour, and familiar in the way drinking from a puddle might feel if you'd been doing it your whole life. Lunch is approaching, and it's time to completely recalibrate your idea of what counts as a meal. Gone are the days of 17 different kinds of artisanal bread. Here you get barley, period. Sometimes it's bread, sometimes porridge, sometimes just plain barley, sitting there judging your expectations. The olive oil they use has been sitting in clay jars for so long, it may have evolved. It's not bad exactly, just aged. Fresh isn't a thing here. Storage means putting it in a pot and hoping nothing grows in it. The oil has a greenish tint, maybe from the olives, maybe from whatever's been living in it for 6 months. Best not to ask. Meat is for special occasions, and by special, we mean someone got married or died, often both. Same goat. Most days it's legumes, but not the kind on rustic wooden boards in food blogs. These lentils have seen things. They've given up. Cooking them is an act of despair. First you boil them until they stop crunching. Then you keep boiling until they feel like wet gravel. Seasoning includes herbs, blind hope, and a whispered prayer to Demeter that they won't cause 2 days of digestive regret. Vegetables technically exist, but they make you understand why ancient people prayed so much. Onions that can make you cry from across the street. Garlic that could be classified as a weapon. Greens that taste like they were watered with disappointment. The onions are unforgettable. These aren't gentle, caramelize me onions. These are aggressive, unapologetic, sinus-destroying onions. Cutting one is like opening a tiny homegrown chemical weapons lab. Cheese shows up occasionally. When the goats feel cooperative, it's made by leaving milk out until it becomes something solid, then aging it until it develops character. That character is usually aggressive, confrontational, or mildly hazardous, but it's still cheese. And when protein is rare, you don't ask questions. And the wine. Oh, the wine. Ancient Greeks diluted theirs, because drinking it straight could actually kill you. That's not an exaggeration. The alcohol content was so high, undiluted wine was considered poison, so they mixed it with water, ratios that would make a sommelier cry. The dilution level wasn't personal. It was social code. Too strong, and you were a barbarian. Too weak, and you were a child. There was a correct balance, just enough to soften the world, not enough to start a war with Sparta. Fish is available near the coast. If someone got lucky, fresh fish is eaten immediately, because refrigeration won't exist for another 2,000 years. The rest, salted, dried or brined, until it tastes like leather soaked in salt water and disappointment. Bread, as always, is the centerpiece, but not the soft, airy comfort food you're used to. This bread is dense, heavy, made with whatever grain is available, ground by hand, mixed with water, and baked in ovens with questionable temperature control. It's chewy, dry, and likely indestructible. Most bread is made from barley. Wheat is expensive. Barley grows where other grains go to die. Nutritionally, it's somewhere between cardboard and hope, but it keeps you alive, and that's all anyone's really asking of their carbs. Honey is the only sweetener. There's no sugar cane, no sugar beets, just bees, and their sticky gold is more valuable than most metals. A spoonful can turn a meal from barely edible to almost pleasant. That's why beekeepers are respected. And stealing honey, that can get you exiled. Or worse. Now that you've survived breakfast, barely, it's time to find out what work means in a world with no screens, no coffee shops, and no idea what balance looks like. Because here, work isn't something you do, it's what life is, all of it, sun up to sundown, and sometimes longer. If you're a man, congrats, you won the ancient gender lottery. Your job options include farmer, craftsman, merchant, or philosopher. That means you'll get intimate with dirt, splinters, dishonest customers, or poverty, depending on your path. If you're a woman, you'll be running a household, weaving endlessly. Or if you're from the right family, serving as a priestess, which mostly means interpreting signs from gods who speak through charred goat livers. The 8-hour workday doesn't exist. Labor unions? Never heard of them. OSHA compliance? That's adorable. Here, you work from the moment the sun rises until long after it sets. And if you stop, you don't fall behind, you die. That's the system. Farming means ploughing fields with wooden tools, dragged by animals that are just as miserable as you are. No tractors, no irrigation, no weather apps. Just you, a stick, a mule, and a fragile hope that the gods aren't in a bad mood this year. The act of ploughing itself is punishment. You walk behind a mule, gripping a crude wooden blade, trying to carve into sun-baked dirt. The animal doesn't want to do this. You don't want to do this. The ground actively fights back. It's like gardening with a toothpick, while balancing on a bicycle that doesn't want to move. Craft work isn't easier. Everything is handmade, from nothing, every time. Need a pot? Better become a potter. Want shoes? Learn to work leather. Want anything? You're building it, yourself. Because delivery doesn't exist. And even if it did, no one's bringing it to you. Pottery alone is a nightmare. First, you dig up your own clay. Then you clean it by hand, removing rocks and debris. You shape it with your feet powering the wheel. You let it dry just enough to not crack. Then you fire it in a homemade kiln, praying it doesn't explode. All of that just for a water jug. Leatherworking is worse. First, you kill an animal, which, emotional damage aside, is only the beginning. Then you skin it, cure the hide with salt, soak it, stretch it, cut it, and stitch it using thread made from sinew. The result? Sandals that last for years, but smell like decay for months. Metalwork? Even more brutal. You find ore, build a furnace hot enough to melt it, smelt the metal, and hammer it into shape while it's still glowing. Burns are constant. Carbon monoxide is a given. And the tools you produce may work, but no one would accuse them of precision. Trade sounds better, but it's not. You walk for days, or ride a cart. You carry your goods, your life savings through lands full of bandits, storms, pirates, and wars. You might arrive to find your market wiped out by plague, or that your product is worthless now, or that the city you were heading to no longer exists. Let's talk about the social hierarchy. It's basically a pyramid scheme, except no one's selling essential oils. They're selling survival and social status. At the top, citizens, free men born of Athenian parents. They can vote, own land, and argue about politics over diluted wine. Think verified Twitter users, but with more body odor and fewer consequences. But citizenship comes with strings. Military service is mandatory. Jury duty can last months. Political assemblies? Loud, chaotic, and mandatory. If you're rich, you're expected to fund public projects out of your own pocket. Democracy isn't free, it just invoices differently. Military service is no joke. You fight in tight formations, with bronze shields and heavy armor. You stab with spears while trying not to be stabbed. It's like an aggressive group hug with fatal consequences. Below citizens are the metics, foreigners who live in Athens but will never be considered true Athenians. They can work, pay taxes, even get rich, but they can't vote, own land, or participate in politics. They're permanent outsiders, tolerated but never embraced. Ironically, metics often outperform citizens. They can't coast on privilege, so they become expert craftsmen, merchants, even thinkers. But no matter how skilled they are, they're locked out of power and protection. Always guests, never hosts. Women occupy their own special category. Important, but not really considered people. They run households, raise children, manage domestic economies, but can't vote, own property, or leave the house without permission. It's like being a CEO who isn't allowed to sign contracts or attend meetings. Their responsibilities are massive. They handle food production and preservation, weave textiles, raise kids, administer basic healthcare, observe religious duties, and run the entire household, all while being legally considered minors who need a male guardian to act on their behalf. Wealthy women at least have slaves to share the burden. Poor women do everything themselves, plus help in the fields or with crafts. They're running full-scale operations on zero sleep and zero rights. Children are tiny laborers in training. No playdates, no piano lessons, no after-school clubs. Just here's a task. Get good at it. Childhood is brief, functional, and mostly focused on not dying. Infant mortality is high. So high that many children aren't even named until they've survived a few years. The ones who live, put to work as soon as they can walk. Boys help with trades or farming. Girls help with childcare and housework. Education, when it exists, is limited. It means memorizing poetry, doing basic math, and staying physically fit. Reading and writing, rare. Universal education, that's a dream still 2,300 years away from reality. And then there are the slaves. Let's pause here, because this is where the humor stops. Slavery in ancient Greece wasn't just an economic tool, it was the foundation holding everything else up. The leisure that allowed men to philosophize, make art, and build democracy. It was built on the backs of people who had no choice. Every comfortable moment you've experienced in this ancient Greek adventure has been made possible by someone else's forced labor. That bread you ate, made by slaves. The water you washed with, carried by slaves. The clothes you're wearing, woven by slaves. The house you're staying in, built by slaves. Slaves in ancient Greece came from various sources. Prisoners of war, people sold to pay debts, abandoned children, and victims of piracy. Once enslaved, they had no legal rights. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at their owner's discretion. Some were treated relatively well, especially skilled craftsmen or household managers, but they were still property. The moral complexity of slavery in ancient Greece is staggering. The same society that invented democracy and philosophy also treated human beings as livestock. The same people who created beautiful art and literature also built their civilization on the systematic dehumanization of entire populations. It's a sobering reminder that even in our historical fantasy, we can't escape the reality that many of humanity's greatest achievements were built on exploitation and suffering. The ancient Greeks gave us philosophy, art, and democracy, but they also gave us a masterclass in how to rationalize treating other human beings as property. But let's try to lighten the mood again. Dwelling on the horrors of history is depressing, and you still have the rest of the day to get through. Entertainment in ancient Greece consists of whatever you can create with your own hands, your voice, and your imagination. No TV, no movies, no TikTok. Just people sitting together, telling stories, singing songs, and performing dramatic scenes that would make modern method actors weep with envy. Theatre is where the ancient Greeks truly shine. Picture this. Thousands of people sitting on stone benches carved into a hillside, watching actors in elaborate masks perform tragedies about gods, mortals, and the catastrophic consequences of hubris. No microphones, no special effects, just pure vocal power and dramatic timing. The comedies are even sharper, satirical and bold, the kind of humor that would get you cancelled on Twitter before you could say Aristophanes. The masks are both beautiful and terrifying, designed to project emotion all the way to the back row. They're exaggerated to the point of grotesque. Tragic masks show suffering so profound, it makes modern drama look like light entertainment. Comic masks are wild, leering, and often include exaggerated genitalia that would make today's costume designers cry. Actors are all male, even for female roles, which leads to interesting interpretations of womanhood from men who clearly haven't spent much time talking to women. The results are hilarious, and often for the wrong reasons. Music happens everywhere, all the time, because what else are you going to do? People play lyres, flutes, and drums made from whatever materials they can find. No one expects you to be amazing. They just expect you to join in. It's like living in a city-wide karaoke session. Everyone's slightly off-key, and nobody cares. The instruments themselves are handmade. Lyres crafted from tortoise shells, animal gut, and carved wood. Flutes carved from bone or reeds. Drums made from stretched animal hide over clay or wooden frames. If you want to play, you also have to build. Music here includes a bit of carpentry, a bit of butchery, and a lot of trial and error. Music theory is still in its infancy. Most compositions are based on modes that sound unfamiliar, almost alien to modern ears. The scales are different, the rhythms complex, the result strange, haunting, and oddly beautiful. It's like listening to music from another planet that just happens to use the same materials we do. Sports are a big deal, but not in the way you're used to. These aren't weekend workouts or casual gym visits. Ancient Greek athletics are serious business. They blend religious ritual with intense physical competition in ways that would leave modern sports scientists speechless. The Olympic Games happen every 4 years, and they're so important that wars literally stop so people can attend. Imagine if the World Cup could pause global conflict. That's the level of cultural weight we're talking about. Events include running, wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, and the pentathlon. But don't imagine clean, rule-heavy modern sports. Olympic boxing goes until one fighter is unconscious or dead. Wrestling allows holds banned in today's competitions. Chariot racing is basically horse-powered demolition derby with an alarming fatality rate. And yes, athletes compete nude. This eliminates equipment advantages, but introduces some major psychological challenges. They cover themselves in olive oil to protect against the sun, which also makes them incredibly slippery. Every event becomes part competition, part accidental slapstick. Training takes years. Athletes follow strict regimens, supervised by professional trainers who treat them like prized livestock. Diet, discipline, and pressure are relentless. Winning brings glory to your entire city. Losing, that shame can echo for generations. Symposia are drinking parties dressed up as intellectual gatherings. Imagine a group of men reclining on couches drinking diluted wine and having philosophical conversations that feel profound at least while the wine lasts. It's like a TED Talk met a bachelor party. Less PowerPoint, more nudity. There are rules, of course. The wine-to-water ratio is usually 3 parts water to 1 part wine. A symposiaric oversees the proceedings. Speakers take turns posing questions. Games mix drinking with intellectual challenges. The goal? To get just drunk enough to loosen your thoughts, but not so drunk that you forget how to argue about Plato. Topics include love, justice, governance, big questions, discussed through the night. These aren't casual chats, they're structured debates that shape ideas and reputations. Women, for the most part, are excluded, except for entertainers, musicians, dancers, and courtesans. That exclusion creates a parallel world, a male intellectual space, entirely separate from the domestic one, where women actually run everything. Religion in ancient Greece isn't a weekend activity. It's everywhere, in everything, like social anxiety but divine. The gods aren't distant forces whispering from the clouds. They're nosy neighbors with lightning bolts. They borrow your tools, take credit for your luck, and blame you for your own misfortunes. They live on Mount Olympus, an actual mountain you can see on a clear day, which makes them feel very close. Too close. Zeus is the king of the gods. Think middle manager with sky powers. He delegates everything, claims all credit, and has a dating record that would get him banned from every HR department in existence. Yet somehow, he's still in charge. Every home has a shrine to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, because fire is life. It cooks your food, lights your room, keeps you from freezing. Letting the fire go out isn't just bad luck, it's potentially fatal. The hearth must be tended constantly. Feed it, watch it, keep it from burning down the house. It's like a pet, one that can kill everyone if ignored. Guess who manages it? Women. Naturally, Hermes gets offerings at crossroads. Because travel is risky, and every little divine help counts. The roads themselves aren't roads, they're vague dirt suggestions, filled with bandits, wild animals, and confused armies. Travel requires maps, weapons, and optimism bordering on delusion. Athena watches over Athens like a divine security system with a PhD. She's the goddess of wisdom, war strategy, and crafts. Basically your smartest friend, if she were also a battle-ready ninja. Athens belongs to her, literally. She won the city in a contest against Poseidon. He offered a saltwater spring. She offered an olive tree. Food, oil, and wood versus a glorified puddle of brine. No contest. Practicality wins. Dionysus gets honored every time wine is poured, which is every day, because water is unreliable, and wine is the ancient world's answer to filtration. Every sip becomes a miniature act of worship. His festivals make modern raves look tame. Days of drinking, dancing, theatre, and ecstatic madness. The goal? To become one with the god. Translation: get so drunk you forget you're mortal. Demeter controls the harvest. Her mood decides whether you live or starve. The myth of her daughter Persephone explains the seasons. When Persephone's in the underworld, Demeter's too depressed to grow anything. That's winter. Keep her happy, or you won't eat. Apollo handles music, poetry, healing, and prophecy. He's basically a one-god liberal arts degree. But medicine here is mostly prayer and plants that might be poison. So, good luck. The oracle at Delphi speaks for Apollo. Her prophecies are accurate but useless. Vague enough to be true only after the fact. Like a horoscope, but with more incense and fewer disclaimers. Aphrodite rules love, beauty, and sex, which means she's behind 90% of ancient drama. Her meddling leads to affairs, betrayals, wars, and the occasional city being burned to the ground. Her temples include sacred prostitution. Yes, exactly what it sounds like. Worship through intimacy. It makes her temples some of the richest in Greece. It's religion meets economics meets extremely awkward theology. Ares is the god of war. Not noble war, not strategy, just raw, chaotic violence. Even the other gods think he's unpleasant. That tells you something. He doesn't plan, he charges. He doesn't inspire courage, he inspires fear. Ares isn't a warrior poet. He's the embodiment of rage with a spear. Festivals are frequent, loud, and unavoidable. The streets fill with music, dancing, and people in their nicest tunics, which isn't saying much. Flutes scream, lyres twang, it's joyful and jarring all at once. Animals are decorated with garlands, led calmly through crowds, and deep down, they probably know something's up. Because sacrifices are central. Not random violence, but ritual. The gods get the fat and bones burned in offering. The people get the meat. It's religion, feast, and food distribution rolled into one. It's more personal than modern factory farming, but it's also hard to ignore that you're personally involved in the death of something that just looked you in the eye. Even sleep has its own god, Hypnos, and dreams belong to Morpheus. Dreaming isn't escape, it's communication. Warnings, guidance, healing, or just a glimpse into another world where logic takes the night off. People take dreams seriously. The sick sleep in temples of Asclepius, god of healing, hoping for dream visions that bring cures. Leaders consult dream interpreters before making decisions. Ordinary folks see dreams as messages from gods or the dead. Dream incubation is the practice of sleeping in sacred places, following rituals, and preparing to receive visions. It's ancient Google, except you don't type anything, and the results come while you're unconscious. There are temples, yes, grand, solemn, columned, but real worship often happens in passing. A touch on a statue's foot, a whispered prayer before planting seeds, a flame lit at dawn. Temples like the Parthenon are marvels, not just religious sites, but symbols of wealth, power, and culture. They're civic centers, banks, art galleries, monuments. But for most people, faith lives in quiet places, household shrines, roadside markers, springs and groves. It's not something you do, it's something you live. Greek religion doesn't shout, it whispers. And in the stillness of night like this, those whispers feel close. The gods are near, watching, intervening, not always kindly. Medical care in ancient Greece is a mix of prayer, herbs, and hopeful guesswork. Got a headache? Drink willow bark tea and pray it's not a tumor. Broken bone? Set it, splint it, and hope it heals straight. Fever? Try bloodletting, because obviously you've got too much blood. The theory of humours dominates everything. The body has 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness? That's an imbalance. Treatment? Balance them back by vomiting, bleeding, or purging. It's like your body is soup, and the doctor's trying to fix the recipe by adding or removing fluids until you stop complaining. Sometimes this works. Willow bark contains salicin, similar to aspirin, but mostly it's educated flailing with a touch of divine hope. Hippocrates is starting to suggest that disease might have natural causes, not just divine punishment, radical stuff. His famous oath, "Do no harm," hasn't been written yet. For now, the motto is closer to, try something and see what happens. Tools are limited. There are no x-rays, no blood tests, just questions like, how do you feel? And is that swelling normal? Diagnosis is vague. You have a fever, your leg is broken, you're dying. Not much in between. Dental problems? You're out of luck. No anesthesia, no drills, no root canals, just pain and the slow resignation that your teeth will hurt until they fall out. At which point, you'll survive on whatever you can mash with your gums. Toothaches are treated with prayer, herbs, and alcohol. Sometimes someone brave tries to yank the tooth out with basic tools, but infection from dental surgery is so common, most people just live with the pain and hope it passes. Decay is universal. Even the rich go toothless by middle age. It's just accepted, like weather or taxes. Childbirth. It's a gamble every single time. Women deliver with the help of midwives, experienced, practical, but without tools, anesthesia, or knowledge of bacteria. Sterile is a concept no one's imagined yet. Midwives know what to do when things go normally, but complications, bleeding, infection, breech births often lead to death. Women die from things modern medicine could fix in minutes. Those who survive may deal with pain, injuries, and long-term health issues. Many babies don't make it. Infant mortality is high, so high that parents often wait to name their children until they're sure they'll survive. That emotional distance would break modern hearts. But here, it's protection. Surgery exists, but only as a last resort. No anesthesia, beyond maybe some wine and a leather strap to bite. Imagine having a tumor removed while fully conscious, by someone whose training is, I've seen this done before, and the gods will guide my hand. Tools are basic. Knives, saws, needles. Bleeding is hard to control. Infection is a constant threat. Most operations involve amputating limbs, draining abscesses, or removing visible growths. Survival is rare enough that surgery usually means you're definitely going to die unless we try something insane. No one knows how infection spreads. They treat wounds with whatever seems reasonable: honey, wine, herbs, or cloth. Sometimes these things help, Honey, for instance, has antibacterial properties, but most of the time, people are just doing something to feel less helpless. Mental illness is another mystery. Causes vary. Maybe divine punishment, maybe too much black bile, maybe poor moral character. Treatments, exercise, prayers, restraints, diet changes, wait and see. There's no concept of mental health as its own thing. Depression is melancholy. Anxiety is restlessness. Psychosis? Either divine madness or demonic possession. You're lucky if people think you're touched by the gods. Not so lucky if they think you're cursed. The sun starts sinking toward the horizon. It casts everything in golden light, the kind that makes even filthy walls and scratchy tunics look almost romantic. Almost. You've survived a full day in ancient Greece, which is more than many actual Greeks managed. You've eaten weapon-grade bread, drunk wine that's mostly water, worked until your hands hurt, and discovered that privacy is centuries away from invention. Your back aches from straw that's older than you are. Your stomach protests the switch from processed snacks to barley and mystery figs. Your skin's dry, your hair's feral, your teeth feel like they're holding a grudge. But here's what sinks in. People lived like this, for centuries, and they didn't just survive, they found joy. They told stories we still read, made art that still moves us, thought thoughts we're still arguing about, invented democracy, theatre, the Olympics, and they did all that while living in conditions modern people wouldn't tolerate for a weekend. It's absurd and humbling. Maybe there's something valuable in that kind of life. One where your biggest decision is whether to add thyme to the lentils, where entertainment is gossip in the courtyard, where your to-do list is fetch water, make bread, don't die. Or maybe we're just romanticizing. Because it's easy to admire ancient simplicity when you're holding a smartphone and sitting in air conditioning. As darkness falls, real, total darkness, you get ready for bed. Preparation is simple. Check the fire, cold kills, store the food, rats bite, lie down on straw and surrender to discomfort. No Netflix, no scrolling, no kitchen raids. Just the kind of sleep your brain forgot it needed, because nothing's glowing at you. Your circadian rhythm resets like a machine returned to factory settings. Your mind quiets, not because you forced it, but because there's nothing left to do. The stars overhead? They're the same ones we see now, but they're brighter here, not because the stars changed, but because there's no light pollution to dim them. The sky isn't just decoration, it's a roof, alive, immediate, a place the gods might actually live. You can see the Milky Way, clear, bold, stretching like a river of light. No wonder people thought it was the path of souls to the afterlife. You lie on your straw bed, listening. A goat bleats somewhere. Footsteps shuffle on stone. Someone adjusts a blanket in the next room. No sirens. No humming appliances. No glowing clocks. Just quiet life winding down. Your thoughts drift not to bills or emails or tasks, but to simple questions. Will it rain? Will the bread rise? Will the gods keep the plague away? As you lie there, your modern brain does the math. Infant mortality hovers around 30 to 40%. 1 in 3 kids never sees their 5th birthday. If you make it to adulthood, your life expectancy might hit 45 if you're lucky. Women face childbirth, like soldiers face war. Men face actual war, usually involving sharp objects and a phalanx formation. There's no savings, no backup plan, a single bad harvest, one infection, or a poor political decision. It could wipe your entire family out. And yet, this civilization didn't just scrape by. It created lasting beauty. Art, math, literature, architecture, philosophy, science. They built cities and wrote plays. They thought deeply about life and death and virtue, all while living in conditions we'd call unlivable. So what have we gained? longer lives, clean water, reliable food, pain relief, safe childbirth, vaccines, refrigeration, antibiotics, glasses, electricity, toilet paper. But what have we lost? Maybe a sense of community, a life lived with natural rhythms, the awareness that death is always near, but so is meaning. The hearth fire is now just glowing embers. You hear someone stir nearby. Fabric rustles. Wood creaks in the cooling air. Everything's been cleaned, set aside, made ready. Jars are filled. Tools are stacked. The day has ended, and tomorrow waits. And in this moment between sleep and waking, between now and then, you feel it. You've seen what they saw. Not just ruins or myths, but the living world behind them. The aching backs, the shared bread, the laughter in the courtyard. You were one of them. Just for a day. You carried water, ate rough bread, laughed at jokes told 100 times, felt sun and ash and olive oil on your skin. You lived without clocks, without alarms, without screens. And somehow it all still worked. And now, as your thoughts begin to blur, something settles. Not comfort, not clarity, but understanding. You've seen how humans lived when life was stripped down to its barest truths. When each breath, each step, each meal was earned. It wasn't easy, it wasn't safe, but it was real. And you made it. You lived a full day in ancient Greece. Modern life might be complicated, stressful, and full of its own problems, but at least you don't have to worry about whether your olive oil has developed sentience, whether that pain in your side is appendicitis, which would be a death sentence, or whether the army from the neighboring city-state is planning to show up and enslave everyone you've ever cared about. The ancient Greeks gave us the foundations of Western civilization, but they also gave us a healthy appreciation for how far we've come since then. And honestly, that might be their greatest gift of all. The morning mist clung to the narrow pass like a shroud, and King Leonidas knew it would be his last dawn. For 2 days, his 300 Spartans had held the hot gates Thermopylae against the largest army the world had ever seen. Now, as he adjusted his bronze helmet and felt the familiar weight of his spear in his hand, he could hear them coming, the footsteps of immortality marching towards certain death. But this story doesn't begin with that final morning. It begins 3 days earlier, when a Persian herald arrived in Sparta with an ultimatum that would echo through history. Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of the vast Persian empire that stretched from India to Egypt, had sent his messenger with a simple demand: give me earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission. The Persian Empire had already conquered most of the known world, and now it turned its hungry gaze toward the quarrelsome city-states of Greece. The herald stood in the Spartan agora, his silk robes a stark contrast to the rough red cloaks of the warriors surrounding him. He was a man who had delivered ultimatums to kings across the known world, watching proud monarchs prostrate themselves before Persian might. His voice carried the authority of an empire that had never known defeat. King Xerxes offers you his friendship. Submit now and your people will be spared. Your city will be protected. Your culture will be preserved under the benevolent rule of the great king. He gestured toward the modest buildings of Sparta, so different from the golden palaces of Persepolis. The great king is merciful to those who acknowledge his supremacy. Your warriors will find honor in his service. Your women will know the protection of Persian law. Your children will grow up as subjects of the greatest empire the world has ever known. Leonidas, now in his 60s but still bearing the scars and muscled frame of a lifetime warrior, listened in silence. Around him, his fellow Spartans waited with the patience of predators. These were men who had been bred for war since childhood, taken from their mothers at age 7 to begin the brutal agoge training that turned boys into living weapons. They knew no profession but fighting, no glory but death in battle, no master but Sparta itself. The herald continued, his confidence growing as he interpreted the Spartan silence as submission. The great king's army numbers in the millions. His ships darken the sea from horizon to horizon. When he marches, the earth trembles. When he speaks, nations kneel. You have seen what happened to the Lydians, to the Babylonians, to the Egyptians. All the great kingdoms of the world have acknowledged his supremacy. Only you, small Greek cities, remain outside his empire. He pulled out a scroll, unrolling it to reveal a map of the known world. Red ink marked the boundaries of Persian territory, a vast expanse that dwarfed the tiny Greek peninsula. Behold the empire of Xerxes, he said. From the Indus to the Nile, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, all men bow before him. Your entire confederation of cities could fit into a single province of his domain. When the herald finished, Leonidas stepped forward. His response was characteristically Spartan, brief and devastating. If you want earth and water, Persian, come and take it. The herald's confident expression flickered. He had not expected defiance from such a small city. You would challenge the great king? You, who number perhaps 8,000 warriors against an empire of millions? Another Spartan, Dientekis, a veteran whose arms bore the scars of countless battles, laughed with genuine amusement. Your great king commands many men, Persian, but we have something he lacks. And what is that? The herald demanded. Free men, Dientekis replied. Your millions fight because they must. We fight because we choose to. Your soldiers fear their king more than their enemies. We fear nothing at all. The herald's face darkened with anger and disbelief. You mock the great king? He commands 1,000,000 soldiers, ships that blacken the sea, archers whose arrows will blot out the sun when they fire. Dientekis grinned, showing teeth chipped from years of biting leather armor straps in battle. Good, then we'll fight in the shade. The herald looked around at the assembled Spartans, searching for some sign of sanity, some indication that these men understood the magnitude of what they were rejecting. But he saw only calm faces and steady eyes, the expressions of men who had made peace with death long ago. This is madness, he said finally. The great king offers you honor and life. You choose shame and death. Leonidas stepped closer, and the herald instinctively stepped back. The Spartan king's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. Persian, go tell your king that he may rule the bodies of men, but he will never rule their souls. Here in Sparta, we choose how we live and how we die, and we choose to die free. The herald departed, his silk robes billowing as he hurried from the agora. But everyone knew what would come next. Xerxes' army was already marching toward Greece, and the narrow pass at Thermopylae, the only route through which such a massive force could travel, would be their battlefield. To understand why 300 men would march to certain death against impossible odds, you must understand what Sparta had made them. From the moment of birth, every Spartan male belonged not to his family, but to the state. Weak infants were left on Mount Taygetus to die. Strong ones were raised until age 7, then taken to the barracks to begin the agoge, a training program so brutal that many modern militaries would consider it torture. Boys learned to endure pain without crying, to steal food to supplement their meager rations, to sleep on beds of reeds in all weather. They fought each other with clubs and fists until they could barely stand, then fought some more. Those who showed weakness were beaten not just by their instructors, but by their peers, until they either grew strong or died trying. At 20, those who survived became full warriors. They lived in barracks, ate at common messes, and spent their days training for war. Marriage was permitted, but a Spartan warrior could not live with his wife until he was 30, and even then he spent most of his time with his military unit. This system produced warriors, unlike any others in the ancient world. They had no fear of death, because death in battle was the highest honor they could achieve. They had no attachment to wealth, because they owned nothing but their weapons and armor. They had no individual ambition, because their only identity was as part of the Spartan war machine. When Leonidas selected his 300, He was choosing from this elite men who had survived 30 or 40 years of the harshest military training ever devised, who had proven themselves in countless battles, who literally knew no other way of life except war. Back in the royal palace, Leonidas faced a crisis that went beyond military strategy. The Carneia, a religious festival sacred to Apollo, was beginning. Spartan law absolutely forbade military campaigns during this holy period. To march out with the full army would be not just illegal but sacrilegious, a violation of divine law that could bring the wrath of the gods down upon Sparta itself. His wife, Queen Gorgo, found him staring at a map of the past spread across a bronze table. She was one of the few women in Greece who could speak freely to her husband about matters of war and politics, a privilege of Spartan women that shocked other Greeks. While Athenian women were confined to their homes, Spartan women owned property, conducted business, and were expected to contribute to political discussions. The Ephors will never agree to mobilize during the Carneia, she said, referring to the 5 magistrates who governed Sparta alongside the kings. The Ephors were powerful men, elected annually by the citizens, and they had the authority to overrule even royal decisions that violated Spartan law. "I know," Leonidas replied, his finger tracing the narrow coastal path that led through the mountains to Thermopylae. "They've already refused my request to march with the full army." Old Demaratus spoke for 2 hours about the sanctity of the festival, the importance of not offending Apollo. "So what will you do? Let the Persians pour through the pass unopposed?" Leonidas was quiet for a long moment, studying the map. Thermopylae, the hot gates, was the only route a large army could take from northern Greece into the south. The mountains were too steep for cavalry, the coastal route too narrow for the massive supply trains that kept Persian armies fed. If someone could hold the pass, even briefly, it would buy time for the other Greek cities to prepare their defenses. "I'll take my personal guard," he said finally. 300 men. We'll march north under the pretense of a reconnaissance mission and buy time for the other city-states to prepare. Gorgo stared at him, her intelligent eyes calculating the odds. She had been raised in the Spartan tradition that valued military thinking above almost everything else. 300 men against 1,000,000? That's not a military expedition, that's suicide. Perhaps it's the only way to save Greece. He rolled up the map with steady hands. "If we can hold them for even a few days, Athens will have time to evacuate their city and prepare their fleet. The other cities will rally. The Persians will learn that Greeks don't submit easily. And if you fail, then we'll have died as Spartans should, with our shields or on them." He turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes the same expression she had fallen in love with 30 years earlier. The look of a man who had chosen his path and would not be turned from it. Gorgo moved closer, placing her hand on his armored chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath the bronze. "The people will call you mad. Even some Spartans will say you threw away 300 of our best men for nothing. Let them say it. History will judge whether we were mad or the only sane men in Greece." He covered her hand with his own. "Besides, what would you have me do? Sit in this palace while Persian slaves place chains on Greek necks? Hide behind Spartan walls while free cities burn?" She smiled, and he saw in her expression the pride that had made him love her. Spartan women were taught to value courage above life itself, to send their sons and husbands to war with the words, "Come back with your shield or on it." A Spartan woman would rather be the widow of a hero than the wife of a coward. "Then go," she said, "and take with you the knowledge that Sparta stands behind you, even if Sparta cannot march beside you." Choosing the 300 was both simple and agonizing. Leonidas couldn't take just any warriors. He needed men who had living sons to carry on their family lines. In Sparta, death in battle was glorious, but dying without heirs was a tragedy that could end a bloodline forever. The criteria were specific and heartbreaking. Each man must have proven himself in previous battles, must be in the prime of his fighting years, and must have male children to continue his lineage. This meant leaving behind some of Sparta's finest warriors, simply because they were too young to have families, or because their sons had died in earlier conflicts. One by one, he called his chosen warriors to the palace. These were veterans of countless battles, men whose spears had tasted Persian blood in earlier conflicts along the Ionian coast. They knew the odds they faced, and they came anyway. Alpheus, a grizzled warrior with grey threading his beard, brought his teenage son to the farewell ceremony. The boy, barely 17 and not yet old enough for military service, tried to look brave, but his hands shook as he embraced his father for what they both knew would be the last time. "Remember," Alpheus told him, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "A Spartan warrior comes home with his shield or on it. There is no shame in death, only in cowardice. If news comes that I fell at Thermopylae, you will mourn for one day, then rejoice for the rest of your life that your father died well." The boy nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Around them, similar scenes were playing out as other warriors said goodbye to their families. Wives embraced husbands they would never see again. Children tried to memorize their fathers' faces. Old men who had fought in previous wars gripped the hands of younger warriors, passing on final pieces of advice about fighting Persians. Pantites, another veteran whose arms bore scars from battles across the Greek world, was suffering from an eye infection that left him nearly blind in one eye. He begged to be included anyway. "I can still hold a spear," he insisted, his good eye blazing with desperation. "I can still die for Sparta. Please, my lord, don't leave me behind while my comrades march to glory." But Leonidas refused, his voice gentle but implacable. "Stay here, old friend. Guard the city. Train the boys who will replace us. That is your duty now. And it's no less important than what we go to do." Pantites would later hang himself in shame, unable to bear being left behind while his comrades marched to their deaths. His suicide would become part of Spartan legend, a reminder that for these warriors living without honor was worse than dying with it. The 300 chosen men represented the cream of Spartan society. There was Deinachus, the wit whose jokes had become legendary throughout the army. Alpheus the veteran, whose tactical knowledge was respected even by the kings. Procles, whose strength was said to rival that of Heracles himself. Each man was not just a warrior but a leader in his own right, capable of commanding others and making split-second decisions in the chaos of battle. They were also in many ways already dead men. Spartan culture had taught them to view death in battle as the ultimate achievement, the goal toward which their entire lives had been aimed. They didn't fear death, they feared dishonor, cowardice, failure to live up to the standards set by their ancestors. The 300 Spartans left Sparta in the pre-dawn darkness, their red cloaks invisible in the gloom, their bronze armor gleaming dully in the starlight. They marched in perfect silence, no talking, no singing, just the steady rhythm of sandaled feet on stone and the soft clink of bronze against bronze. Each man carried his own equipment, a bronze helmet with a horsehair crest, a bronze cuirass molded to fit his torso, bronze greaves to protect his shins, and a large bronze-faced shield decorated with the lambda symbol of Lacedaemon. Their primary weapon was the dory, an 8-foot spear with an iron point and a bronze butt spike. Each also carried a short iron sword as a backup weapon. The equipment alone represented a fortune by ancient standards. A complete panoply of Spartan armor cost more than most men earned in a year. But these were not poor men pressed into service. They were the elite of Spartan society, warriors who could afford the best equipment and had spent decades learning to use it. As they traveled north through the mountainous terrain of the Peloponnese, other Greeks joined them. 700 Thespians, led by their general Demophilus, fell in step with the Spartans. These men from the small city of Thespia had made the same calculation as Leonidas: better to die fighting than to live as slaves. 400 the bands, though their loyalty was questionable, added their spears to the force. The bands had a complicated relationship with both Sparta and Persia, and some suspected that these men were more hostages than allies, brought along to ensure Theban good behavior. 1,000 Phocians agreed to guard the mountain path that could allow the Persians to outflank the pass. These local men knew every goat track and deer trail in the mountains around Thermopylae. Their job was to watch for Persian attempts to circle around the Greek position. Various other contingents joined as well. Locrians, Melians, and men from other small cities who preferred to die free rather than live enslaved. By the time they reached Thermopylae, Leonidas commanded about 7,000 men, still laughably outnumbered, but enough to fill the narrow pass and give the Persians a real fight. The pass itself was a natural fortress created by millennia of geological activity. On one side rose cliffs so steep they were unclimbable even by mountain goats. On the other lay the sea, its waters too deep and rough for armies to wade through. The narrowest point, the middle gate, was only 14 meters wide, just broad enough for a single wagon. Here, if anywhere, a small force might hold back an empire. Ancient legends said that Heracles himself had created the pass when he needed a route through the mountains. More practically, it was the result of an earthquake that had split the coastal mountains, creating the only passage large armies could use to move between northern and southern Greece. The hot gates got their name from the sulfur springs that bubbled up from the earth nearby, filling the air with the smell of rotten eggs and creating warm pools where locals had bathed for centuries. These springs were considered sacred to various gods, and their presence added a religious dimension to the upcoming battle. For 2 days they waited. Leonidas used the time to prepare his position, building a stone wall across the narrowest part of the pass and positioning his men for the coming storm. The wall wasn't meant to stop the Persians. It was designed to channel them into the killing ground, where Greek spears would have maximum effectiveness. The Spartans worked with the efficiency of men who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this moment. They knew their business, and they went about it with calm professionalism. Veterans instructed younger men on the best techniques for fighting in the narrow space of the pass. Weapons were sharpened, armor was adjusted, and contingency plans were discussed. On the morning of the second day, Persian scouts appeared on the distant hills. Small figures on horseback, visible for moments before disappearing back into the landscape. Soon after, the horizon darkened with dust clouds that marked the approach of the largest army in human history. When the Persian force finally came into view, even the battle-hardened Spartans fell silent. The sight was beyond anything they had imagined, beyond anything that human history had ever produced. Ships covered the sea like a moving forest, their sails blotting out the horizon. Soldiers filled the coastal plain from one edge of vision to the other. Persians, Medes, Scythians, Indians, Egyptians, Arabs, and dozens of other subject peoples pressed into service by the great king. The Persian army was a display of imperial power that took hours to fully deploy. Cavalry units wheeled into position with mechanical precision. Infantry formations stretched back as far as the eye could see. Siege engines and supply wagons created their own traffic jams as the massive force tried to organize itself on the limited coastal plain. Herodotus would later write that when the Persians shot their arrows, they literally darkened the sky. When they marched, the earth trembled under millions of feet. When they shouted their war cries, the sound could be heard for miles. This was not just an army. It was the physical manifestation of imperial ambition, power made visible on a scale that dwarfed every previous human achievement. A Persian herald rode forward under a flag of truce. "King Leonidas," he called, "Xerxes the great king offers you one final chance. Lay down your arms and surrender, and you will be allowed to live as governors of Greece under Persian rule." Leonidas conferred briefly with his captains, then replied, "We will lay down our arms when the Persians lay down theirs." The herald tried again. "The great king is generous. He offers you titles, lands, wealth beyond imagining. Why choose death when you could choose life and honor?" This time, Leonidas didn't even pause. "Persian, go tell your king that here, Free men stood against a tyrant. We choose death with honor over life in chains. The attack began at dawn on the third day. Xerxes, confident that his vast numbers would overwhelm the Greeks in hours, sent wave after wave of infantry against the Spartan wall. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. The Persians had superior numbers, but they were forced to attack through the narrow pass in formations no wider than the Spartan phalanx. Their wicker shields and leather armor were no match for Greek bronze. Their short spears couldn't reach past the 18-foot sarissas of the phalanx. The Spartans fought with mechanical precision. When the front rank grew tired, they stepped back and the second rank took their place. When spears broke, new ones appeared instantly. When men fell, others stepped over their bodies to fill the gaps. The Persians came in waves. First the Medes, proud warriors from the Iranian plateau. The Spartans cut them down like wheat. Then came the Saka, fierce nomads from the steppes. They fared no better. Finally, Xerxes committed his immortals, the elite guard that had never known defeat. The immortals were called that because their number never diminished. When one fell, another immediately took his place to maintain their strength at exactly 10,000 men. They carried gold-tipped spears and wore flowing robes that billowed dramatically as they charged. Against the Spartan bronze and discipline, they might as well have been children with sticks. By midday, the pass was choked with Persian dead. But still they came. Leonidas realized that his men, despite their superior armor and training, would eventually tire. He needed a new strategy. Fall back, he ordered, and the Spartans turned and ran, or appeared to. The Persians, seeing their enemies fleeing, broke formation and pursued them up the pass, screaming in triumph. But it was a trap. At a predetermined point, the Spartans wheeled around and charged back down the slope, their heavy bronze spears and shields crushing into the disordered Persian ranks. The slaughter was horrific. Persians, caught between the Spartan charge and their own advancing comrades, were trampled underfoot or driven into the sea. The few who escaped ran back to their lines with tales of warriors who seemed more demon than human. By evening the pass was a charnel house, and Xerxes had gained not a single step. That night, as Leonidas tended to his wounded and counted his dead, a shadow fell across his campfire. A local Greek named Ephialtes had come to speak with him, but not to offer aid. "My lord," Ephialtes said, his voice shaking with nervous energy, "I know a path through the mountains, a goat track that leads around the pass. If the Persians take it, they can come down behind your position." Leonidas studied the man's face in the firelight. Ephialtes was deformed, a hunchback whose twisted spine had prevented him from serving in the Spartan army. In his eyes, Leonidas saw the bitter resentment of a man who had been rejected by those he desperately wanted to join. "Why tell me this?" Leonidas asked. "Because I want to fight beside you? Give me a place in your ranks and I'll keep the secret." But Leonidas couldn't do it. Ephialtes' twisted body couldn't bear the weight of armor or hold a shield properly. In the tight formations of the phalanx, he would endanger every man around him. "I cannot," Leonidas said gently, "but you can still serve Greece. Go south, warn the other cities, help them prepare their defenses." Ephialtes' face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You reject me like all the rest. Fine, but you'll regret it." He disappeared into the darkness, and Leonidas knew with cold certainty that the traitor was heading for the Persian lines. By morning, the Phocians guarding the mountain path had fled, and Persian troops were moving through the hills to surround the pass. Leonidas faced a choice: retreat and live to fight another day, or stay and die. He gathered his men as the sun rose. "The Persians have found a way around us," he announced. "In hours they'll attack from both sides. Anyone who wishes to leave may do so with honor. You've already done more than duty required." Most of the allied Greeks took him up on the offer. The Thebans departed, then the Phocians, but the 300 Spartans remained. along with 700 Thespians who declared they would rather die as free men than live as Persian slaves. As the last of the allies disappeared down the southern road, Leonidas turned to his remaining men. "Eat well," he told them. "Tonight we dine in Hades." The final assault came from both directions at once. From the north, Xerxes hurled his remaining troops against the Spartan wall. From the south, the Persian immortals who had flanked the pass came charging down the hillside. Caught between two forces, the Greeks pulled back to a small hill within the pass, the last defensible position. Here they made their final stand. Leonidas fell early, struck down by a Persian arrow. His men fought over his body like lions, determined that their king would not be desecrated by enemy hands. 4 times the Persians seized the corpse. 4 times the Spartans drove them back. When their spears broke, they fought with swords. When their swords shattered, they fought with daggers. When they had no weapons left, they fought with stones and bare hands. Alpheus, the grizzled veteran who had said goodbye to his son, took 3 arrows in his chest but continued fighting until a Persian spear finally found his heart. Deinechus, the warrior who had joked about fighting in the shade, lived to see the arrows of the Persian archers literally darken the sky before he fell beneath their storm. The Thespians died beside their Spartan allies, proving that courage was not the monopoly of any single city. When the end came, not one of the 300 Spartans or 700 Thespians remained alive. Xerxes, when he finally stood among the bodies, was beside himself with rage. His army had lost perhaps 20,000 men, taking a pass defended by fewer than 1,000. The delay had cost him weeks of campaigning time, and news of the Spartan resistance was already spreading across Greece. In his fury, he ordered Leonidas' body crucified and his head mounted on a spike. An unprecedented dishonor for a fallen king. But even in death, Leonidas had achieved what he set out to do. The 3 days at Thermopylae had given the other Greek cities time to prepare. More importantly, it had shown that the Persian army could be beaten. When the news reached Athens, Themistocles began preparing his naval strategy that would destroy the Persian fleet at Salamis. When it reached Sparta, the ephors finally agreed to send the full army north. Years later, when the Persians had been driven from Greece and the danger had passed, the Greeks erected a monument at Thermopylae. On it was inscribed the most famous epitaph in military history. "Go tell the Spartans, you who read, we took their orders, and here lie dead." But perhaps the real monument to Leonidas and his 300 was something far greater. The idea that free men, fighting for their homes and families, could stand against any tyranny, no matter how powerful. That idea would echo through history, inspiring everyone from the Romans who defeated Hannibal, to the Americans who fought for independence, to the British who stood alone against Nazi Germany. The 300 Spartans died at Thermopylae, but their sacrifice lit a flame that tyranny has never been able to extinguish. The clay cup sat on the rough wooden table like an accusation. Inside, the hemlock was already dissolved, its bitter alkaloids waiting to shut down the nervous system of the most brilliant mind in Athens. Socrates picked up the cup with steady hands, but his student Crito could see the slight tremor that betrayed even the philosopher's legendary calm. "Master," Crito whispered urgently, "it's not too late. The guard has been bribed. We can have you out of the city before dawn. Megara is only a day's ride. You'll be safe there." Socrates looked at his old friend with eyes that held both affection and infinite sadness. "My dear Crito, after 70 years of life and 30 years of teaching, would you have me become a fugitive now?" Outside the prison cell, Athens buzzed with rumors and arguments. The trial had ended weeks ago, but the city was still divided. How had it come to this? How had Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the city of Pericles and Phidias, condemned its greatest philosopher to death? To understand Socrates' final day, you must first understand the man himself. Born around 470 BCE to a stonemason and a midwife, Socrates had spent his entire adult life doing something that seemed utterly harmless, asking questions. But in Athens, questions had become dangerous. But for decades, Socrates had wandered the agora, the gymnasiums, and the symposiums of Athens, engaging anyone who would listen in philosophical discussions. His method was deceptively simple. He would approach someone who claimed to possess knowledge or wisdom, and through careful questioning, demonstrate that they actually knew nothing at all. He questioned generals about courage, only to show they couldn't define it. He questioned priests about piety, revealing their ignorance of the gods they served. He questioned politicians about justice, exposing the emptiness of their rhetoric. He questioned craftsmen about their trades, proving that even their practical knowledge was built on assumptions they'd never examined. "The unexamined life is not worth living," he famously declared. But in a city where political success depended on appearing wise and confident, examining one's beliefs too closely had become an unwelcome hobby. Socrates himself claimed to know only one thing, that he knew nothing. This admission of ignorance, he argued, made him wiser than those who thought they possessed knowledge they actually lacked. The oracle at Delphi had proclaimed him the wisest man in Athens, and through his investigations, Socrates had concluded this was true, not because he was wise, but because he alone recognized his own ignorance. Young men flocked to Socrates like moths to a flame. The sons of wealthy families would abandon their studies in rhetoric and athletics to follow the philosopher through the streets, listening to him demolish the certainties of their elders with devastating logic. Among his most devoted followers were some of the most controversial figures in Athenian history. Alcibiades, the brilliant but treacherous general who had betrayed Athens to Sparta; Charmides and Critias, who became leaders of the brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants; and most damaging of all, Plato's cousin Critobulus, who openly mocked traditional Athenian values and religion. These associations would prove fatal. In the minds of many Athenians, Socrates had corrupted the young men of the city, turning them against democracy, tradition, and the gods themselves. The charges brought against him in 399 BCE reflected these fears. 1. Corrupting the youth of Athens. 2. Not believing in the gods of the state. 3. Introducing new divinity. But these formal charges masked deeper anxieties. Athens had recently suffered a devastating defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The democracy had been temporarily overthrown by the 30 Tyrants, who had murdered thousands of citizens before being restored. The city was traumatized, looking for someone to blame for its misfortunes. Socrates, with his questioning of traditional values and his associations with traitors and tyrants, made a perfect scapegoat. 3 men brought the charges against Socrates, each representing a different faction of Athenian society that had reason to hate the philosopher. Meletus was a young poet, representing the artistic community that resented Socrates' dismissal of poetry as mere imitation of reality. In Plato's account of the trial, Socrates would devastate Meletus with his cross-examination, showing that the young man hadn't even thought through his own accusations. Anytus was a wealthy businessman and politician who had suffered personal humiliation at Socrates' hands. Years earlier, the philosopher had questioned Anytus about virtue and education, publicly demonstrating that the successful businessman knew nothing about the subjects he claimed to understand. Anytus represented the commercial class that saw Socrates as a threat to social stability. Lycon was a rhetoric teacher who viewed Socrates as professional competition. The philosopher's method of questioning undermined the entire educational system that men like Lycon had built their careers on. If truth came through self-examination rather than formal instruction, what need was there for professional teachers? Together, these 3 men represented the coalition that had turned against Socrates: artists who resented his critique of their work, businessmen who feared his undermining of traditional values, and educators who saw him as a threat to their livelihood. The trial took place in the Helia, the largest court in Athens, before a jury of 501 citizens chosen by lot. This wasn't a trial in the modern sense, with judges interpreting law and controlling procedure. Instead, it was a democratic spectacle where the accused and accusers each gave speeches and the jury voted directly on guilt or innocence. Meletus spoke first, his young voice shaking with righteous indignation as he painted Socrates as a corrupter of youth and an enemy of the gods. He described how the philosopher had filled young minds with doubt and rebellion, turning loyal citizens into enemies of the state. Anytues followed, his businessman's practicality lending weight to the accusations. He spoke of the damage Socrates had done to Athens' social fabric, how his constant questioning had undermined respect for authority and tradition. Lycon concluded the prosecution by attacking Socrates' methods and teachings, arguing that the philosopher's influence had made young men arrogant and disrespectful. When Socrates rose to defend himself, he did something that shocked the court. He refused to apologize or show remorse. Instead, he treated his trial as one more opportunity to examine the unexamined life. "Men of Athens," he began, "I am not going to argue my case with tears and lamentations, or by bringing my children here to arouse your pity. Instead, I will speak to you as one free man to others, about truth and justice." He systematically dismantled the charges against him. Corruption of youth? He challenged anyone to bring forward a young man he had harmed. Atheism? He had always followed his divine sign, a mysterious inner voice that warned him away from harmful actions. Introducing new gods. He had never claimed divine knowledge, only divine ignorance. But most provocatively, he suggested that instead of punishment, Athens should reward him for his services to the city. What would be appropriate for a poor man who has spent his life benefiting you? He should be given free meals for life in the Prytaneum, like an Olympic victor. The jury was not amused. When the votes were counted, Socrates was found guilty by a margin of just 30 votes out of 501, 280 to 2020. It was closer than his accusers had expected, but it was enough. Under Athenian law, the prosecution could propose a penalty, and the defense could propose an alternative. The jury would then choose between the two options. Meletus proposed death. Socrates' friends expected him to propose exile, which the jury would certainly accept as a reasonable alternative. Instead, the philosopher again shocked everyone by initially suggesting that Athens should give him free meals for life. When he saw the jury's reaction, he grudgingly proposed a fine of 1 mina of silver, a trivial amount that seemed to mock the proceedings. Finally, after urgent consultations with Plato and his other supporters, Socrates agreed to propose a fine of 30 minas, a substantial sum that his friends would pay. But it was too late. The jury, feeling insulted by Socrates' apparent arrogance, voted for death by an even larger margin, 360 to 141. Under Athenian law, executions couldn't take place during religious festivals. As luck would have it, the annual sacred mission to Delos was about to begin, a month-long ritual voyage that would delay Socrates' death for 30 days. He spent this time in prison, but it was unlike any imprisonment in history. His cell became a philosophical saloon, with students and friends visiting daily to engage in the same kinds of discussions that had made him famous throughout the Greek world. Crato came almost every day, pleading with his old friend to escape. "Your death will be a stain on all of us," he argued. "People will think we abandoned you, that we cared more about money than your life." But Socrates refused to consider escape. "Tell me, Crito," he said, "if the laws of Athens could speak, what would they say to me if I fled? Would they not accuse me of trying to destroy them?" He had spent his life advocating for justice and respect for law. To break the law now, even an unjust law, would make him a hypocrite. On his final day, Socrates engaged in one last philosophical discussion with his closest followers. The topic, appropriately, was the immortality of the soul. Death is either a dreamless sleep, or a journey to another place where all the great souls of history dwell, he argued. If it's sleep, what could be more peaceful? If it's a journey, imagine the conversations I'll have with Homer and Hesiod, with all the heroes of the past. His student Simmias raised an objection. But master, how can we be sure the soul survives death? What if consciousness simply ends? Socrates smiled. My dear Simmias, the soul is the source of life itself. It cannot die any more than fire can be cold, or snow can be hot. Death is simply the separation of soul from body, and the soul, being immortal, continues its journey. Sebes, another student, pressed further. But even if the soul is immortal, how do we know it retains memory and personality after death? Consider learning, Socrates replied. When we learn mathematics, are we discovering new truths or remembering eternal ones? A slave boy who has never studied geometry can be led to discover the Pythagorean theorem through questioning alone. This suggests that all learning is really remembering, that our souls possess knowledge from before birth and will retain it after death. The arguments went on for hours, but gradually the students fell silent. Outside the sun was setting, and they all knew what that meant. The jailer entered with obvious reluctance. He was in tears, unusual for a man whose job involved administering death. Socrates, he said, I've overseen many executions, but I've never met a man more noble or gentle than you. I know you don't blame me for what I must do. Of course not, my friend, Socrates replied. You're only doing your duty. The hemlock had been prepared according to tradition, ground from the spotted hemlock plant, and mixed with water. The poison worked by gradually paralyzing the nervous system, starting with the feet and working upward until it reached the heart and lungs. Socrates took the cup and examined it with the same curiosity he had always shown toward new experiences. What do you say to making a libation from this drink? He asked the jailer. We only prepare as much as we think sufficient, the man replied. Then I'll simply drink it and pray to the gods for a favorable journey to the other world. He raised the cup and drank it down in one draught, as calmly as if it were wine at a symposium. As the poison began to work, Socrates walked around the cell until his legs grew heavy, then lay down on his bed. The numbness spread slowly upward, and he described the sensation with scientific detachment. Crito, he said as the paralysis reached his waist. We owe a cock to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt. It was a strange final request. Asclepius was the god of healing, and people traditionally sacrificed a cock to him when recovering from illness. Some scholars believe Socrates was suggesting that death was a cure for the disease of life. Others think he was simply remembering an actual debt that needed to be paid. His last words, according to Plato, were, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please don't forget. Then he was gone. The execution of Socrates sent shockwaves through the Greek world. Many who had supported his conviction began to have second thoughts. Anytus was eventually exiled from Athens when public opinion turned against him. Miletus faded into obscurity, his reputation forever tainted by his role in the philosopher's death. But the real aftermath was philosophical, not political. Socrates' death convinced his students that Athens was no longer a safe place for free inquiry. Plato left the city and travelled throughout the Mediterranean, eventually returning to found the Academy, the first university in Western history. There he would write the dialogues that preserved Socrates' method and teachings for posterity. Through Plato's writings, the man who claimed to know nothing became the teacher of everyone who came after. The irony was perfect and terrible. By killing Socrates, Athens had made him immortal. The philosopher who had spent his life examining the beliefs of others became the eternal examiner of all human beliefs. His method of questioning, the Socratic method, would become the foundation of Western education. Today, more than 2,400 years after that final cup of hemlock, Socrates' influence continues to shape how we think about thinking. Every time a teacher asks, "What do you mean by that?" or "How do you know that's true?" they're using his method. His death raised questions that every society must answer. What is the relationship between the individual and the state? When is civil disobedience justified? How much questioning can a society tolerate before it becomes dangerous? Socrates chose to obey an unjust law rather than break a just system. He died for his beliefs not as a martyr seeking glory, but as a philosopher seeking truth. In his final hours, he demonstrated that the examined life, even when it leads to death, is indeed worth living. The clay cup was eventually cleaned and reused, as was the custom in Athens. But the questions Socrates asked with his last breath continue to echo through history, challenging each generation to examine their own unexamined lives. The rain hammered down on the muddy banks of the Hyphasis River like arrows from an angry god, and for the first time in his life, Alexander the Great was facing something he had never encountered before: mutiny. Not from his enemies, he had crushed all of those, but from his own men, the Macedonian veterans who had followed him from the mountains of their homeland to the very edge of the known world. Standing in his saturated purple cloak, water streaming from his long hair, Alexander looked across the swollen river toward India's endless eastern plains and felt something crack inside his chest. Beyond those muddy waters lay more kingdoms to conquer, more cities to burn, more glory to win. But behind him, in the tent lines of his army, he could hear something that chilled him more than any enemy war cry, the sound of his soldiers saying no. For 13 years they had followed him across 22,000 miles of the known world. They had crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, marched through the furnace heat of Syria and Egypt, climbed the ice-locked passes of the Hindu Kush, and fought battles in deserts, mountains, and jungles that no European had ever seen. They had made him master of an empire larger than any in human history. But now, as the monsoon rains turned their camp into a sea of mud, and their King of Kings stood staring eastward with the unquenchable hunger that had driven them so far from home, the greatest army in history was ready to mutiny rather than take another step. To understand how it came to this moment of crisis on an obscure Indian river, you have to understand what Alexander had become and what he had lost in his journey from Macedonian prince to master of the world. Born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedon, Alexander had been raised to believe he was destined for greatness. His father, Philip II, had transformed Macedon from a backward mountain kingdom into the dominant power in Greece. His mother, Olympias of Epirus, claimed descent from Achilles and filled her son's head with stories of divine ancestry and heroic destiny. Philip had hired Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, to tutor the young prince. For 3 years in the gardens of the sanctuary of the nymphs at Mieza, the philosopher had shaped Alexander's mind, teaching him politics, ethics, medicine, and natural science. But perhaps more importantly, Aristotle had given him a copy of Homer's Iliad, which Alexander kept under his pillow, along with a dagger for the rest of his life. The Iliad became Alexander's roadmap to glory. He identified completely with Achilles, the hero who chose a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one. Like Achilles, Alexander would rage against the dying of the light. Like Achilles, he would make his name immortal through deeds of war. But unlike Achilles, Alexander had been given the tools to conquer not just single heroes, but entire worlds. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE, 20-year-old Alexander inherited not just a throne, but the most advanced military machine in the ancient world. The Macedonian phalanx was evolution in action. 16,000 men armed with 18-foot pikes, fighting in formation so tight that their shields overlapped like scales on a snake. But Alexander's true innovation was his use of combined arms. Heavy cavalry, the companions would punch holes in enemy lines, while the phalanx advanced to exploit the breakthrough. Light infantry, archers and siege engines provided support, while scouts and engineers solved the practical problems of moving an army across continents. More importantly, Alexander had solved the greatest challenge facing any conqueror: logistics. His army was designed to live off the land, carrying minimal supplies while moving at unprecedented speed. They could cover 30 miles a day when necessary, appearing like a thunderstorm where enemies least expected them. Alexander's first campaigns read like a fever dream of conquest. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with 35,000 men and a dream of avenging Greece's sufferings during the Persian Wars. What followed was military genius on a scale the world had never seen. At the river Granicus, he shattered a Persian army and opened Asia Minor to conquest. At Issus, he defeated Darius III, the great king of Persia, in person, capturing the Persian royal family and treasure. At Gaugamela, he destroyed the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world, making himself master of the Persian Empire at the age of 25. But victory only fed Alexander's hunger for more victory. After conquering Persia, he pushed into Central Asia, fighting guerrilla wars in Afghanistan and crossing the Oxus into Sogdiana. When he had subdued every enemy from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush, he turned his eyes toward India, the mysterious land beyond the edge of the Persian Empire. The army that crossed into India in 327 BCE was no longer the force that had left Macedon 8 years earlier. Of the original 35,000 men, fewer than 10,000 remained. Disease, battle, and the simple attrition of constant campaign had taken their toll. The survivors had been replaced by Persian recruits, Greek mercenaries, and allied troops from a dozen conquered nations. But more than personnel had changed. The Macedonians themselves were different men than they had been at the Hellespont. They had seen wonders that no European had ever imagined. The pyramids of Egypt, the hanging gardens of Babylon, the fire temples of Persia. They had grown rich on the spoils of empire, each common soldier now wealthier than a Macedonian noble had been at the war's start. They had also grown tired. These men had fought in the snows of the Hindu Kush and the deserts of Gedrosia. They had besieged cities whose names they couldn't pronounce, and conquered peoples whose languages they didn't speak. They had followed their king through landscapes that seemed to come from dreams or nightmares, always with the promise that the next victory would be the last. The next campaign would bring them home. But Alexander's promises had proven hollow. With each conquest, his ambition only grew larger. The man who had wept because there were no more worlds to conquer was discovering that the world was larger than anyone had imagined. India was unlike anything the Macedonians had encountered. The heat was crushing, the humidity overwhelming. Diseases they had no names for swept through the camps. The monsoon rains turned roads into rivers, and rivers into inland seas. The enemies they faced were equally alien. Indian war elephants, beasts the size of houses with ivory tusks and armoured howdahs, trampled through their ranks like living siege engines. Indian steel was superior to anything they had seen, flexible, sharp, and nearly unbreakable. Indian tactics relied on mobility and surprise rather than the set-piece battles Alexander preferred. At the Hydaspes River, Alexander had won perhaps his greatest victory, defeating King Porus and his elephant corps in a battle fought during a thunderstorm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. His beloved horse Butophilus, who had carried him from Macedon to India, died of exhaustion after the battle. Alexander founded a city and named it Butophila in the horse's honour, but something died in the king that day as well. The army that limped away from the Hydaspes was exhausted, diseased, and homesick. They had been campaigning continuously for 8 years, fighting battles in climates that seemed designed to kill them. Their equipment was worn out, their supplies were running low, and their faith in their king's promises was beginning to crack. The breaking point came at the Hyphasis River, in what is now northern India. Alexander's scouts had returned with reports of vast kingdoms to the east. The Gangaridae and Prussi ruled by the Nanda dynasty from their capital at Pataliputra. These kingdoms, they said, could field armies of 200,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and 2,000 war elephants. To Alexander, this was not a deterrent, it was an invitation. Here were new worlds to conquer, new glories to win. He assembled his officers, and announced plans to cross the Hyphases and continue eastward until they reached the Ganges and the Eastern Ocean that Aristotle had taught him must lie beyond. But for the first time in 13 years of campaigning, his officers said no. Coronus, one of his most trusted generals, spoke for them all. "Sire, we have followed you farther than any army in history has ever marched. We have conquered every enemy you have set before us. But we are not gods, and we cannot march forever. Our men are exhausted, our equipment is failing, and our hearts long for home. We have won enough glory to last a dozen lifetimes. Let us return to Macedon as conquerors, not continue until we die as exiles in some distant land." Alexander's rage was terrible to behold. He dismissed the assembly and retired to his tent, where he remained for 3 days, refusing to see anyone or issue any orders. This was the tantrum of a spoiled child, but it was also the desperation of a man who saw his dreams of infinite conquest slipping away. To understand Alexander's reaction to the mutiny, you must know about his visit to the oracle of Zeus Ammon in the Libyan desert 3 years earlier. After conquering Egypt, Alexander had made the dangerous journey across the desert to the oasis of Siwa, where the oracle of the Egyptian god Ammon, identified by the Greeks with Zeus, delivered prophecies. What the oracle told Alexander was never revealed, but witnesses reported that the king emerged from the temple transformed. From that day forward, he began to believe that he was not merely descended from the gods, he was a god himself, the son of Zeus Ammon. This divine delusion had grown stronger with each victory. In Persia, Alexander had adopted the customs of the Persian court, demanding that visitors prostrate themselves before him as they would before a god. He had married Roxana, a Sogdian princess, and later Statira, daughter of Darius III, collecting wives like a collector gathers rare jewels. But most telling was his treatment of cities that resisted him. When Thebes rebelled during his first campaign, he had destroyed it completely and sold its entire population into slavery, not as a military necessity, but as a demonstration of divine wrath. When the Sogdian fortress of the rock seemed impregnable, he had told his engineers to give him wings, because nothing is impossible for Alexander. The mutiny at the Hyphases was therefore more than military insubordination. It was a direct challenge to his divinity. If he was truly a god, how could mere mortals refuse his commands? On the 3rd day of his sulking, Alexander emerged from his tent and announced that he would sacrifice to the gods for guidance. The entire army gathered to watch as he approached the altar, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He sacrificed a bull to Zeus, his claimed father, asking for a sign about whether to continue the campaign. The omens, interpreted by his court soothsayers, were uniformly negative. The gods, it seemed, did not favor further advance. But Alexander was not satisfied. He sacrificed again, this time to all the gods of the army: Greek, Macedonian, Persian, and Indian. Again the omens were negative. The gods were telling him to turn back. Finally, in desperation, he sacrificed to the river itself, asking the Hyphasa to grant him passage. But even this local deity seemed to reject his plea, as if the very land were conspiring against his ambition. Standing before the smoking altar, surrounded by his silent army, Alexander finally accepted what his men had been trying to tell him. The conquest was over. Alexander was too proud to simply admit defeat and march home. Instead, he announced that the gods had revealed to him that his destiny lay not in further eastern conquest, but in the consolidation of his existing empire and the exploration of the southern seas. He ordered the construction of 12 giant altars on the banks of the Hyphasis, each 60 feet high, dedicated to the 12 Olympian gods. These would mark the eastern limit of his empire and stand as eternal monuments to his achievements. But even in retreat, Alexander's ambition found new outlets. Instead of simply marching back the way they had come, he decided to explore the Indus River system, building a fleet to sail down to the Arabian Sea while the army marched alongside. The journey down the Indus was nearly as harrowing as the Eastern campaign would have been. At the city of the Mali, Alexander was nearly killed when an arrow pierced his lung during an assault on the walls. His men, thinking him dead, went berserk and slaughtered every living thing in the city. Men, women, children, even dogs and horses. The worst was yet to come. When the fleet reached the mouth of the Indus, Alexander divided his forces. The ships under Nearchus would explore the coast of the Arabian Sea. The army, under Alexander himself, would march back to Babylon through the Gedrosian Desert, modern-day Balochistan. The Gedrosian Desert was a hell on earth. Temperatures reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and dropped to near freezing at night. Water was so scarce that men killed each other for a mouthful from their water skins. The sand dunes shifted constantly, obliterating landmarks and swallowing entire supply columns. For 60 days, the army struggled through this wasteland. Men collapsed from heat stroke and were left to die. Entire units simply vanished into the shifting sands. The proud veterans who had conquered the world were reduced to eating their pack animals and drinking their own urine to survive. Alexander himself suffered with his men, refusing the few comforts available to a king. When a scout found a small pool of muddy water and brought it to him in his helmet, Alexander poured it out on the sand rather than drink while his soldiers thirsted. By the time they reached the Persian city of Pura, barely half the army remained. Of the 85,000 men who had entered the desert, perhaps 40,000 emerged. It was a catastrophe that made all of Alexander's victories seem hollow. Back in Babylon, Alexander tried to rebuild his shattered forces and consolidate his empire, but the cost of his ambitions was becoming clear. The empire was too large to govern effectively, too diverse to hold together, too dependent on Alexander's personal presence to survive his eventual death. Revolts had broken out in Greece while he was in India. His treasury, despite the wealth of conquered Persia, was nearly empty from the cost of constant campaigning. His generals were openly questioning his decisions, and his troops were increasingly unwilling to follow him into new adventures. Most telling of all, Alexander himself was changing. The golden-haired boy who had dreamed of matching Achilles' glory had become a paranoid tyrant, seeing enemies everywhere. He had executed Philotas, one of his closest friends, on charges of treason. He had killed Cletus, who had saved his life at the Granicus, in a drunken rage when the old general criticized his adoption of Persian customs. The man who had once inspired absolute loyalty through his courage and charisma was now ruling through fear and the memory of past glories. Alexander's last great dream was the conquest of Arabia. He believed that if he could add the Arabian Peninsula to his empire, he would finally have achieved the perfect synthesis of East and West that would justify all his conquests. He spent months planning the campaign, gathering ships and supplies, studying the geography and customs of the Arabian tribes. It would be a return to the lightning warfare that had made him famous, swift, decisive, and devastating. But as he prepared for this final adventure, his body began to betray him. Years of campaigning, combined with numerous wounds and the stress of command, had taken their toll. He suffered from recurring fevers, possibly malaria contracted during his Indian campaigns. On June 1st, 323 BCE, Alexander attended a banquet given by his friend Medius. He drank heavily, a habit that had grown worse since the mutiny at the Hiphasis. During the party, he was seized by a fever so severe that he had to be carried from the room. For the next 11 days, the fever consumed him. His generals gathered around his bedside, but he could barely speak. When they asked who should inherit his empire, he whispered, "To the strongest," words that would plunge his conquests into 40 years of civil war. Some historians believe he was poisoned, possibly by Antipater, his regent in Macedon, who feared for his position. Others think it was simply disease, typhoid, malaria, or poisoning from excessive alcohol consumption. But perhaps the most likely explanation is that Alexander died of what can only be called a broken heart. In his final delirium, witnesses reported that Alexander wept constantly. not from pain, but from grief. He had conquered the known world by the age of 30, but he had never found what he was truly seeking. He had wanted to be Achilles, to achieve immortal glory through heroic deeds. But Achilles had died young and beautiful, mourned by all who knew him. Alexander was dying alone, surrounded by men who were already calculating how to divide his empire among themselves. He had wanted to be a god, to transcend the limitations of mortal existence. But he had discovered that even gods could be defeated, not by enemy armies, but by the simple refusal of other mortals to believe in their divinity. Most of all, he had wanted to keep moving, to keep conquering, to never stop until he had claimed every horizon. But at the Hyphasis River, his own men had shown him that even the greatest conqueror must eventually face limits. Limits imposed not by geography or enemy strength, but by the simple human need for home, rest, and peace. Alexander died at 32, master of an empire that stretched from Greece to India, but unable to master his own limitless ambitions. His body was preserved in honey and gold, eventually coming to rest in a crystal sarcophagus in Alexandria, where it became a tourist attraction for Roman emperors and curious philosophers who came to gaze upon the earthly remains of the man who had tried to conquer the world. But his real legacy was more complex and enduring than the boundaries of his empire, which began fragmenting even before his funeral. He had spread Greek culture across the known world, creating the Hellenistic civilization that would shape everything from art to science to religion for the next 1,000 years. Cities he founded, Alexandria in Egypt, Bucephala in India, a dozen others scattered across 3 continents, became centers of learning and commerce that outlasted the political structures he had created. He had also created a template for military genius that would inspire conquerors from Julius Caesar to Napoleon Bonaparte. His tactics were studied in military academies, his strategies copied by generals who could never match his speed or audacity, but could learn from his innovations in combined arms warfare and strategic mobility. But perhaps most importantly, he had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of human ambition. Standing on the banks of the Hyphasis River, weeping for worlds he would never conquer, Alexander had shown that even the greatest achievers must eventually confront the gap between their dreams and the constraints of reality. The rain that had fallen on the Hyphasis eventually stopped, and the river returned to its normal flow. But the tears that Alexander shed that day, tears of frustration, rage, and ultimate recognition of his own mortality, had watered the ground for every dreamer who would come after, showing them both how high humans could rise and how far they could fall. His empire was divided among his generals, who spent the next 4 decades fighting each other in wars that consumed the wealth he had accumulated and destroyed many of the cities he had founded. But the idea he represented, that individual genius could reshape the world, that human ambition could transcend traditional boundaries, that glory was worth any sacrifice, survived the collapse of his political achievements. In the end, Alexander the Great had conquered everything except the one enemy that defeats all conquerors, the simple truth that no one, not even the son of Zeus Ammon, can have everything they want. The clay cup that would soon claim his life in Babylon was already being prepared, but the real death of Alexander's dreams had occurred years earlier, on a muddy riverbank in India, when the greatest army in history had finally said no to the greatest conqueror in history. And perhaps in that moment of ultimate defeat, Alexander had finally achieved what he had always sought. He had become fully human, subject to the same limitations and longings that define the rest of us. His tears at the edge of the world were not the tears of a god frustrated by mortal limitations, but the tears of a man finally recognizing that being human with all its constraints and disappointments might be enough. A Persian herald rode forward under a flag of truce, his horse prancing nervously as it approached the Greek lines. The man himself was magnificently dressed in silk and gold, his beard oiled and curled in the Persian fashion, his weapons ornamental rather than practical. He had clearly been chosen more for his ability to intimidate through display of wealth than for any military prowess. King Leonidas, he called, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to delivering ultimatums to trembling monarchs. Xerxes the Great King, Light of the Aryans, King of Kings, offers you one final chance. Lay down your arms and surrender, and you will be allowed to live as governors of Greece under Persian rule. Your men will be spared, your families will be protected, you will have gold, titles, and honor in the service of the greatest empire the world has ever known. The herald gestured toward his own magnificent appearance, as an example of Persian generosity. See how the great king rewards those who serve him faithfully. You could live in palaces instead of barracks, wear silk instead of bronze, feast on delicacies instead of black broth. Leonidas conferred briefly with his captains Dienekes, Alpheus, and the other veteran warriors who had followed him to this place. Their faces showed no fear, no uncertainty, only the calm calculation of professional soldiers evaluating their options. After a moment of quiet discussion, he turned back to the herald. "We will lay down our arms," Leonidas replied, his voice carrying clearly across the narrow space between the armies. When the Persians lay down theirs, the herald's expression tightened. This was not the response he had expected from men facing such overwhelming odds. He had delivered similar ultimatums to kings across the known world, and they had all ended the same way, with submission, gold, and incorporation into the Persian system. He tried again, his voice taking on a more threatening tone. "The great king is generous, but his patience is not infinite. He offers you titles, lands, wealth beyond imagining. Your city will be spared the fate of those who resist. Your women will not be enslaved. Your children will grow up as Persian nobles rather than Greek corpses. Why choose death when you could choose life and honor?" This time, Leonidas didn't even pause to consult with his men. "Persian, go tell your king that here, free men stood against a tyrant. We choose death with honor over life in chains." The herald's composure finally cracked. "You are mad, all of you. The great king commands millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, wealth beyond counting. You are 300 men standing against the might of an empire that stretches from India to Egypt. Your defiance is meaningless, a pebble thrown at a mountain." Dienekes stepped forward, his scarred face split by a grin. "Persian, your king may command millions, but he doesn't understand what he's facing here. We are Spartans. We are the mountain. Let your pebbles break against us." The herald wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward the Persian lines, his silk streaming behind him like a banner of retreat. Behind him, the Greeks began their final preparations for battle. The attack began at dawn on the third day, as the rising sun painted the eastern sky blood red. Xerxes, confident that his vast numbers would overwhelm the Greeks in hours, sent wave after wave of infantry against the Spartan wall. The Persian king had positioned his golden throne on a hill overlooking the pass, where he could watch his army crush the Greek rebellion and demonstrate once again why resistance to Persian power was futile. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, retold around Mediterranean campfires for the next 1,000 years. The Persians had superior numbers, perhaps 100 to 1, but they were forced to attack through the narrow pass in formations no wider than the Spartan phalanx. Their wicker shields and leather armor, adequate for fighting other Persian-style armies, were no match for Greek bronze. Their short spears and curved swords couldn't reach past the 18-foot sarissas of the phalanx. The Spartans fought with mechanical precision that reflected decades of training and generations of military tradition. When the front rank grew tired, they stepped back and the second rank took their place without breaking formation. When spears broke, new ones appeared instantly from the rear ranks. When men fell, others stepped over their bodies to fill the gaps, maintaining the integrity of the formation that was their only hope of survival. The first wave consisted of Median infantry, proud warriors from the Iranian plateau who had conquered much of Central Asia for the Persian Empire. They came forward with confidence, their colourful robes and elaborate headdresses marking them as elite troops accustomed to victory. They struck the Spartan line like a wave hitting a breakwater, and like a wave they were shattered and thrown back. The narrow confines of the pass worked against the Persians in ways their commanders hadn't fully anticipated. Their superior numbers became a liability as men pressed forward from behind while those in front struggled against the Greek spears. The formation compressed into a writhing mass of humanity, where individual skill mattered less than the ability to avoid being trampled by your own comrades. The Spartans, by contrast, had room to fight. Each man had exactly the space he needed to use his weapons effectively. They could see their enemies, choose their targets, and coordinate their attacks with the precision of a machine designed for killing. The slaughter was methodical and terrible. Persian blood soaked into the sandy soil of the pass. Bodies piled up against the stone wall that Leonidas had built, creating their own grisly fortification. The survivors stumbled back toward their own lines, many of them wounded, all of them shaken by their encounter with warriors who seemed more like bronze automatons than mortal men. Next came the Sacco, fierce nomads from the steppes beyond the Caspian Sea, famous for their skill with composite bows and their mobility on horseback. But horses were useless in the narrow pass, and their bows were ineffective against bronze armor at close range. They fared no better than the Medes, leaving their own pile of dead to mark their failure. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, Xerxes committed his immortals, the elite guard that had never known defeat, the 10,000 warriors who were called immortal because their number never diminished. When one fell, another immediately took his place to maintain their strength at exactly 10,000 men. The immortals were the best soldiers in the Persian Empire, hand-picked for their skill and loyalty, armed with gold-tipped spears and wearing scale armor that gleamed like fish skin in the sunlight. They had conquered Babylon, crushed the Lydians, and marched victorious from one end of the known world to the other. No enemy had ever stood against them and lived. Against the Spartan bronze and discipline, they might as well have been children with sticks. The immortals had been trained to fight in the open plains of Asia, where their mobility and archery could be used to maximum advantage. They relied on speed, flexibility, and the psychological impact of their reputation. But in the confines of Thermopylae, trapped between sea and cliff, they became just another wave of infantry to be ground down by the Spartan war machine. By midday the pass was choked with Persian dead, but still they came. Wave after wave of the finest soldiers in the world threw themselves against the Greek line, and wave after wave was broken and hurled back. Xerxes watched from his throne in growing disbelief and rage as his invincible army was stopped dead by a handful of Greeks who refused to acknowledge Persian superiority.